Welcome to this explainer. You know, if you've ever sat down to read ancient texts, you've probably hit that wall. Those dense, honestly kind of mind-numbing lists of names. The book of Matthew is absolutely no exception. But instead of just skimming past it to get to the good stuff, what happens if we treat this genealogy like an intricate, ancient puzzle just waiting to be solved? Today we're going to decode the genealogy of Yeshua and uncover the hidden messages literally woven right into the text.
Right off the bat, we run into a fascinating mystery. Because what seems like a super dry list of ancestors on the surface, it's actually hiding some glaring errors. We're talking missing people, cursed bloodlines, and what honestly looks like incredibly bad math. So let's investigate what the original author was actually trying to communicate here.
No, context is absolutely crucial here. You have to understand that Matthew acts as a direct sequel to the book of Chronicles. Chronicles ended on a pretty bleak note, right? Jerusalem was destroyed, and the land was left with an empty throne. Well, Matthew picks up the pen right there, using these historical records to prove that Yeshua is the rightful, long-awaited heir to that exact throne. Okay, let's dive into this structure. Notice how Matthew deliberately divides Jewish history into three distinct eras. We've got Abraham to David, when the homeland was established, then David to the Babylonian exile, which was a time of massive decline, and finally, Babylon to Yeshua, the era of eagerly anticipating a restored king. But as we look a little closer at these three eras, a very specific pattern starts to jump out. Matthew explicitly organizes the generations into sets of exactly 14. 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to Babylon, and 14 from Babylon to the Messiah. So why? Why this specific number? Why force hundreds of years of ancient history into these perfectly packaged boxes of 14? Well, it all comes down to something called gematria. This is ancient Jewish numerology where letters actually have a numerical value. In Hebrew, the name David mathematically adds up to exactly 14. And even more telling, the letters for Yod Dalet, which translates to strong hand, also equal 14. So the author is using math to secretly signal that this bloodline carries the kingship of David and the delivering strong hand of Yahweh. It's brilliant. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive theological claim. To put it into perspective, 7 is considered the number of perfection, right? And 3 sets of 14 equals 42. Since 6 is the number of man, 6 multiplied by the perfect 7 also gives us exactly 42. He is calculating exactly 42 generations to present Yeshua as the perfect completion of the prophecy, the perfect man. But wait a second, here is where the plot thickens. When we compare Matthew's list to older historical records, there are entire generations completely missing from his list. Why would an author who is trying so hard to prove a legitimate royal bloodline just conveniently leave people out? While he specifically dropped notorious leaders like Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, and the self-appointed Queen Athaliah. You see, in Hebrew genealogies, the word son didn't strictly mean biological, immediate offspring. It could just mean a later descendant. This historical loophole allowed Matthew to intentionally omit these disqualified, particularly wicked leaders from the record. And this omission perfectly aligns with ancient law in action. The Torah actually contains rules about blotting out the names of unrepentant, wicked generations. Basically, if a king was exceedingly wicked, his name was struck from the honored lineage. So we're only seeing the generations that actually counted toward the promise. Now, this brings us to the biggest problem of all, at least if you're reading the English translation. We already know Matthew was absolutely obsessed with these sets of 14, right? But if you sit down and count the names in the final set, from the Babylonian exile to Yeshua, there are only 13 generations listed. Did the guy go through all the trouble of setting up this grand numerical design only to literally forget how to count at the very end? No way. To solve this mystery, we have to look past the English text and check out the older Semitic Aramaic Peshitta translation. And when we do, we find a massive breakthrough. We find the missing link that restores the count to a perfect 14. Now, what's really interesting here is the language itself. The Aramaic text uses two very distinct words, Goah, which means a guardian or kinsman redeemer, and Ba'ala, which means a husband. This subtle nuance reveals that there were actually two entirely different men named Joseph in Mary's life, her older guardian and her husband. Applying this completely fixes our count. Check this out. The 12th generation is Joseph the guardian, the Gara. That makes Mary herself the 13th generation, which leaves Yeshua as the 14th. So Matthew was mathematically perfect all along.
The whole confusion was just a translation error over two different men sharing a super common name.
And this perfectly explains why Matthew's list is so completely different from the genealogy we find in the book of Luke. Luke is tracing Joseph the husband's lineage. Matthew, on the other hand, intentionally focuses on Mary to establish the true, rightful heir, tracing her royal lineage through King Solomon all the way back to Abraham.
Now, focusing on Mary totally shatters the patriarchal norms of the time. Listing women in ancient genealogies was incredibly rare, yet Matthew specifically highlights Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. Why does this matter? Well, it was done deliberately to prove Yeshua came from Mary, fulfilling that ancient Genesis prophecy about the seed of the woman.
Okay, so the math works out, the missing kings are explained, and the focus on Mary makes total sense. But we still have one final glaring mystery. Think about the names Matthew actually chose to include. He included King Jeconiah, and, according to the prophet Jeremiah, Jeconiah was explicitly cursed by God. God declared that no descendant of his would ever prosper or sit on the throne of David again. So how on earth can a cursed bloodline produce the ultimate king?
Seriously, how do you bypass a divine curse? Well, ancient sages taught that while he was exiled in Babylon, Jeconiah genuinely repented. And because God doesn't eternally punish the children of repentant parents, the curse was lifted. It's a restoration we actually see confirmed a bit later in the book of Haggai through Jeconiah's grandson, Zerubbabel. So Matthew includes Jeconiah strictly because he remained the rightful heir. He's showing us that despite all the failures and the literal exile, the legitimate royal bloodline successfully survived the Babylonian exile unbroken. It perfectly paved the way for the throne's restoration despite absolutely impossible odds. What initially looked like a tedious, error-ridden list turns out to be this mathematically precise, historically brilliant legal claim. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. And it really begs the question, if a supposedly simple list of names hides this much profound depth and intentional design, what else is hiding in plain sight within these ancient texts? Keep questioning, guys. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.